Hello YouTube. Today I want to tell you some of the most interesting and fascinating cases from the history of the Soviet UFO research, and some of them quite obscure. I go through tons of materials, reports, sometimes old letters that were sent to me from the Soviet Union that I exchanged with the researchers in that country, and I want to bring up to your attention to what had been revealed in that country, and I think you'll find it very interesting. I also want to ask you that if you want to support my research, please feel free to use my Patreon link in the description box. It does help my research. And one of the first cases that I want to mention was actually brought up by the late Vladimir Azhaja, one of the top Soviet and Russian UFO researchers. This had to do with 1961, and this information was given to him by his friends in the Soviet military. He had good friends, especially in the Navy. But this was from the military branch of the forces and from the army. And he served with those people, and so they were not afraid to confide in him, because UFOs was not a subject you could really discuss in the Soviet Union openly. It happened in the summer of 1961 over Voronezh, when a giant cigar object appeared out of nowhere, and it was 800 meters long. It was gigantic, like I said, and it hovered over thousands of people at the altitude of 1 kilometer. It actually caused panic. But then the object disappeared in the air. That's what it looked like. Sometime later, military jets arrived from the nearby airport but did not find anyone. But as soon as they departed, the cigar came back in the same position. After some minutes, from the rear part of the cigar, flame shot out and the UFO started moving. A few seconds later, it ascended into the sky and disappeared with an incredible velocity, speed. The summer of that year, the very same year, 150 kilometers from Moscow, a gigantic disk appeared, accompanied by several smaller disks. The UFO was located over a military unit, air defense unit, at the height of 20 kilometers. So the command of that unit decided to shoot at the strange disks. However, the missiles that were launched blew up, did not, at the approximately distance of 2 kilometers from the target. The second volley also did not give any results. The smaller disks, at an incredible speed, they descended, and at the same time all the electronics of the missile launching equipment, all of it went out, did not work, stopped functioning. And then the disks formed the same position and left. Azhaja had a lot of interesting information that he revealed, of course, through his life. He passed away in 2018. He was a well-known, like I said, Soviet researcher, even speaking in the West after the Soviet Union was no more. And some of the information he sent me personally. What I find interesting is this. In the 1970s, he was acquainted with the head of the Soviet space program Mission Control Center, Yuli Nazarov, and who was responsible actually for the secrecy and had to make sure that nothing leaked outside of the Soviet Mission Control Center. But he knew, this man, that UFOs existed, and he was active in the so-called UFO underground, because you couldn't really study UFOs officially in the Soviet Union unless you were a scientist, who for the most part did not want to accept existence of UFOs as an extraterrestrial objects or anything else but scientifically explained. So Nazarov told Ajaja how to be introduced to the cosmonauts, and he got the official pass to get to the star city, Звездный городок. And that's where he met Soviet cosmonaut Valery Bykovsky, who passed away in 2019, by the way. They talk about for 1 hour about this and that because the cosmonaut did not want to agree to tell Ajaja about the meeting he had during the orbital flight in outer space, of course. Finally, the assistant to Bykovsky, who was a colonel, was there, and he said, "Come on, Valery, the thing that we saw," and we had to write down that what we had seen was an American satellite. "You remember what we saw?" And Bykovsky said, "No, we shouldn't talk about it. This was something unusual." So this was an interesting observation. They saw something in outer space, but Bykovsky did not want to break secrecy. And that's understandable, but some cosmonauts did. And I urge you to look in my channel, because you will find videos about Soviet cosmonauts speaking openly. This was before anybody else did, and they were quite outspoken about the objects and this phenomena, other phenomena they experienced in outer space. Now, I want to talk about something else that Ajaja also discussed, and I have this from other sources. I don't want to go into too many details, but between June of 14 to 15 in 1980 in Moscow and Moscow vicinity, there were massive observations of UFOs. A very strange formation, which was called Dolphin, was seen over like a quarter of the sky. It was it had a bright center in its head, so to say. It had something like a tail, and in the body you could see bright strings. If that's all how it could be described. Also, at the same time, there were fiery spheres, balls, flying over homes. Apparently, at the same time, something was also observed in space, some other spheres, which look like satellites. This was something else interesting about this case. There was also during the same day, landing of a UFO, which was witnessed by Colonel Karyakin, who worked for one of the top secret institute of the Air Force. He actually, coming back from his watch, he found a bright shining object which was hovering over the ground at a meter, at an altitude of 1 meter. So the colonel tried to approach this object, but there was an invisible barrier which would not let him come closer than 10 meters. The object hovered and then disappeared at an incredible speed. So colonel decided that it was his duty to write a report about this incident. But the authorities would not let this report go anywhere. They just washed it down, and they tried to describe the Dolphin, that it was a phenomenon which you could observe when a satellite would enter the orbit over 100 kilometers, products of the burning and so forth. But nobody wanted to discuss too much about this Dolphin. So this was another case, and it was one of the most interesting cases, as I recall, during that time. This is what I wanted to let you know about some of the information that I've received from Ajaja, but there is something else now about the Soviet Union which almost nobody knows in the United States, except for those who have to know. It was in 1986 that the newspaper Izvestia and then newspaper Sovetskaya Rossiya in 1988 described very interesting observations of Soviet scientists during the laser probing of the atmosphere from from the aboard Il-14 airplane, special airplane, scientists from the Institute of the Optics of the Atmosphere, from the Siberian section of the Academy of Sciences USSR, they observed very unusual phenomena. Something like this. Suddenly, they found information from the photoelectric device that they used for their observations, and it's like the Il-14 was enveloped in clouds, like it jumped into the clouds. But looking outside, they still saw hot sky and the burning sun. They couldn't believe their eyes. However, the thermostat, which immediately registered any changes in the humidity or temperature with the appearance of the clouds, it was silent too. They were hunting, and we don't have too much information in the newspapers, but we know that for about 4 years they were hunting those strange clouds. They saw them in the sky over Central Asia, Far East, and Siberia. This is where that special laboratory aircraft was flying to try to catch the clouds. The altitude of the clouds was about 23 kilometers in the North Pole, around the area of the North Pole. What's interesting, they made photographs which depicted or registered that there were objects that follow this airplane and others, strange, dark, and shining invisible objects, especially after the takeoff of the airplane or before the landing. Some of them were visible disc-like objects, usually dark gray color. There were also strange radioactive and magnetic anomalies, or a reaction of the animals on the infrared pictures that they took. That was it, but there is not much more information available about this special interesting case that took place. But something else about the clouds, you can see in my videos about humanoids of the Baikal and other strange phenomena from that area. This is a lake in Siberia. So in 1984, a Soviet newspaper had a very obscure article about a strange phenomena that was seen in the Baikal Hollow, Lake Baikal. Once they observed a cloud-like formation that very rapidly moved toward the shore. Those who had observed it, they saw for a few seconds a strange air spiral, and the lake down below was boiling, and high waves were rolling across the lake. Of course, scientists would try to explain what it was, but I'm not sure if they were successful. But there's not a lot of information about this case. At least we know something. But also what's interesting, I want to tell you, going back to different obscure files that I have and reports in the Leningrad, from Leningrad, from the ufologists who were active at the time. There are some reports which numbered and whatever was we were able to save. There was a very interesting one from 1973 from Russian Asia, from the area about Chita, a small town of Balei. This town is surrounded by mountains. So one time at the end of the day, the witness saw a slowly moving flat disc which looked like, but was much bigger than the moon. The disk was of greenish blue hue or color. It moved quite slowly, according to the eyewitness, but quicker than maybe necessary, because when he called other people to see it, the disc was gone. So this was a disc of greenish bluish color. Okay, so that's interesting because in 1992, in the book that was published in Moscow and contained my articles in Russian language, which I published since 1980s, and which were later smuggled to the Soviet Union, and then in Free Russia they were published, there was another story. Now, this was a digest. It contained my articles and others about UFOs. Mine were about mostly Western phenomena. So here's what I want to tell you. Remember what I told you about the disc. Now, this digest contained a very interesting information from the files of Russian ufologist Kuzovkin, who unfortunately took his own life and destroyed a lot of valuable UFO information. Why he did it, we'll talk later sometime, but right now I want to tell you, there was a photograph, and I believe it still exists in Russia, those who have whatever remains of his archives. And this is a photograph of a very interesting greenish disc which hovered over the island of Iturup in the Kuril island chain. So, look at my videos in the my YouTube channel about the Kuril Islands and the strange UFO and USO phenomena there, because this is something that is very contemporary, I should say, because Japan is very much interested in taking back the islands and the Russians want to keep them, but there is one island called Matua which even the Americans wanted. A lot of interesting stuff has been going on there, and now it's being controlled completely by Russian military and scientific forces. An expedition was sent there in 2017, and they're very active. Things are being found there. But that's what I wanted to tell you about the discs, because it's very interesting, and I want you to keep this in mind as well. One of the other interesting cases I wanted to mention goes to the area of Borisogledsk. If you read my books, you will find out. This is this area where they have a Top Gun Russian military aviation college, and this is the area when during the Soviet times UFOs actively interfered with the flights of Soviet aircraft, and some of the jets were actually lost. Here's an interesting case. In the summer of 1975, one witness, Paltsev, his last name was Paltsev, was coming to Borisogledsk, and 7 kilometers from the city, he was hitchhiking, so he got off the vehicle and just walked towards the town. He observed. He went out to the field and he observed something very interesting. About 300 meters away, he saw a very strange object, a disc at the size of a usual automobile. It had semi-transparent dome at the top. Paltsev went towards the disc because he saw some humanoid creatures inside, or beings. One, he saw an upturned hand, and he counted 5 fingers. But when he tried to come closer than 30 meters to the object, he encountered invisible obstacle. And it was, his impression was that he stepped into a net from a hammock. He actually lost consciousness and fainted. When he came to, Paltsev again tried to come to that apparatus. And then, not far away, there was a motorcycle driving, and you could see the headlight, and immediately the disc ascended and moved to the other side of the road by the field. Paltsev went also there, but then the UFO just flew towards the forest and disappeared. But he observed a bright orange spot right at the site where the UFO was located, and then it just disappeared, and it also was witnessed by the motorcycle. What's interesting is that Paltsev thought that everything took about 10 to 15 minutes, but actually it was more than an hour that this case took. And remember invisible barrier of Colonel Karyakin actually 5 years afterwards. And this is what happened in Borisogledsk. So that's very interesting. And I also want to tell you now about Colonel Kolchin. And if you read my books, you see a lot of notes referring to him. He was a very interesting Soviet military officer and later on a ufologist. He actually was quite educated, and he was involved in several areas. He worked with the missiles, with the rocket launchers. He was a World War II veteran. Kolchin also finished the military academy in 1947. Then he was one of the professors there, but then he was sent to the Soviet forces in Germany, and he worked in the operational department, which related to secrecy. And I guess he was involved in the Berlin Wall installation. He spoke pure German, fluent German. So later on, he was sent as an advisor to the Egyptian forces in the 1971-1972 during the conflict with Israel. In 1974, he was retired as a colonel. He had a lot of awards and decorations, but he continued actively as a ufologist. And he wrote a number of very interesting books. And participated in Leningrad with the Special Commission for the Research of Anomalous Phenomena, that's how it was called, in the environment, part of the Russian Geographic Society. Very interesting case. He also created some of the movies, was involved in creation of some of the documentaries about UFOs, but that's what I wanted to let you know about him, except for one thing. In 1985, he actually was presenting a report about American organizations, that's how it's called, in the United States, official organizations, and their research of UFOs. And he was talking about Pentagon and CIA and how they actively research UFOs. This was in 1985. And it was such an important and informed report that it was recommended by the Central Commission to study anomalous phenomena, that it would be given to the government of the Soviet Union, to the Presidium of the Academy of Sciences USSR as well, and other agencies, it says, so they could study what Kolchin found. So he had a lot of interesting access, and he knew a lot, and he was active. And I want to tell you one of the interesting cases that took place in 1992. He was involved with it was an exhibit in Moscow, I believe in Leningrad, and the exhibit was called The Secrets of Space. And there he met a few people, including reporters and other military personnel, and he was told how 15 years prior, that's 1977, that a UFO was observed, I guess very large UFO, and the Soviets sent aircraft, their military jets towards it, and UFO disappeared, and one of the jets disappeared when it was approaching that UFO without any trace, and they could not find remnants of that airplane, and those who had witnessed it were fired from the Soviet army. So that's another interesting case. I'll speak about him more some day in other videos, but that's what I wanted to let you know. And as you can see, there is a lot of information that still slowly comes out, and you can find it in the old files, but most of the files, and I'll speak about it, after the fall of the Soviet Union were gone. Thank you, and I'll speak to you again soon.